Yeah, g'day, it's Jason Archer here from AbacusBio. I'm here with Max Tweedie from B+LNZ Genetics, and we're doing a bit of carpool karaoke, and here's James Corbin.
To walk it up.
So, just having a bit of a chat about the issues around yearling heifer mating and what that means for lifetime fertility of cows and what it might mean for our breeding programs. So Max, why do you reckon getting in calf early as a heifer is important?
We acknowledge that it's pretty important how her first mating goes as to how she goes on as a cow. So there's a bit of research that says if she performs well as a heifer and gets in calf early, that in successive matings she gets in calf early again, and she has she's a better reproductive lifetime. She also is more likely to wean a heavier calf because she's getting calf early.
Yep.
And then that calf's going to be older.
Yep.
Come weaning.
Yep. Nice tight joining, nice tight calving. Start moving them onto feed. All those sort of things. So there's lots of management reasons for it, eh?
Yeah, and that's cool because when she comes around to calving next year, she's in fact got longer.
Yeah.
Because she's able to calve early in the season. So the longer she has that thing known as postpartum initius interval, makes her more likely to get back in calf early again.
Yeah. So there's a really interesting bit of research being done by Dairy New Zealand lately in dairy cows, and they took high fertility dairy cows and low fertility dairy cows, and they put them into a research herd, and they've looked for what was different about those cows based on their fertility as cows. And actually the thing that's really standing out that's different is the high fertility cows go through puberty earlier as heifers, get in calf earlier as heifers. So there's a bit of evidence from dairy cows. They're not beef cows, of course, but got lots of the same issues around reproduction. It's all about energy balance, etc. So, yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, there's some other research there that I think was from Australia, from the Beef CRC, that reinforced it as well.
Yeah. So the Beef CRC in their maternal efficiency project had a bunch of heifers, and they had some of them were genetically high fat and some were genetically lower fat, and they've mated those heifers and then they've taken them on, carried them on as cows. Now, what they found was that the higher fat heifers actually went through puberty a bit earlier and got in calf earlier. The interesting thing is, once that heifer's in calf and then she's gone through the cycle and calved, whether she's high fat or low fat didn't seem to make any difference for the subsequent calving. So later on in life, as long as they got into calf, the cows that were lower fat cows performed just as well, but there was a higher dropout of them at that first mating. So yeah,
but I guess by default, if that first mating sets them up for lifetime reproductive performance, they are more likely to do better as a cow anyway.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah. So it's the ones that did manage it that went on and performed all right. So just shows that getting in calf as a yearling and getting calf nice and early preferably is really positive, both from a management or a phenotype point of view in terms of her calf, but also they're probably genetically the ones that you want as well.
Yeah, it's interesting how people say, I'd rather not make my heifers, it's going to knock a year off them at the other end. That's an interesting one, I guess, Jason, because if anything, you get an extra calf earlier at a time when you'd have to be feeding them, chipping away where you've got a calf off them.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's lots of good reasons to make yearling heifers, and part of it is putting that fertility pressure on your herd.
Yeah.
So what, in terms of management then, what do you reckon are the keys in terms of getting these heifers in calf?
Well,
early?
I think the giveaway is just to drive the weight.
Yep.
And to get those heifers as heavy as we can when they hit the bull.
Yeah. So where do you reckon they should be? weight-wise?
Well, see, these all these arguments. People used to give a standard weight for a mating weight for an Angus heifer, and that was 280 kilos years back. I think that's changed. I think the old standard rule of thumb that said heifers must be 70% of their mature weight as yearlings for mating if they want to go forward and be successful. Do you think that rule still applies?
I think we've changed the genetics in our cattle a lot in the last 20, 25 years. So, I think other people around the world are questioning that rule now. So, and I know from the beef progeny test work we're doing that we're finding heifers, we're putting most heifers to the bull. Anything that's sort of commercially acceptable is going to the bull. And heifers are getting in calf at sort of at lower weights. But really good numbers of heifers are getting in calf, anything sort of from 320 kilos upwards as they go to the bull. So, do you reckon most people can achieve that in their farming systems?
Look, I think it's all about balance. So it's about what your priority stock units are, and within your system what you're trying to feed and prioritise. But in terms of driving reproduction and getting extra calves now and later, I would have thought getting your heifers to 320 kilos should be really the benchmark, and that's what people should be striving for, and having a good buddy, a good nudge at it. But there was, it's certainly interesting.
Yeah. So what else? How many of them would you make?
Well, I'm actually inclined to put as many of them to the bull, apart from your scungy ones, as possible.
Yep.
And I think you want to try and restrict. And I think the research suggests that as well. It's trying to restrict the mating period. So I'd allow them 42 days and put them all to the bull.
Yeah, I agree. What about putting the heifers to the bull a little bit earlier than your cow herd? What are you thinking about that?
Well, there's some interesting data there from the US that says that heifers have a longer postpartum estrus interval than cows do. So the time that they take to cycle again after having their first calf is more like 70 odd days rather than a cow at 50 odd days.
Yep.
So that's effectively a whole other cycle, isn't it?
Yep.
So I guess that's some of the idea that if you make your heifers earlier and you're humming them through the end of the winter into the spring, maybe you're more likely when they come around that second mating, they're more likely to get in calf there.
Yeah. So I reckon there's actually two schools of thought out there. I'm more on that school of thought, but personally that's an opinion. Some people say, well, you make your heifers earlier and they don't get in calf any earlier the second time. I think it comes down to whether you feed them. And so some people will say, well, if you make them 3 weeks earlier, then you can't feed them because the grass isn't growing yet. I'd probably argue if that was a critical 3 weeks to put some feed into them, great investment of feed. I haven't done the numbers, but I would think personally that would be a really strategic time to just poke a little bit of extra feed into your heifers, those 3 weeks sort of after she starts calving as a mob, just to try and get them up and get them back in calf as early as you can the second time around, which we all know is the hardest time to get them in calf. They're growing, they're lactating, and they're trying to get in calf.
Yeah, and I mean that's a lot of pressure to put on a young animal, isn't it?
It is.
And I mean, even the natural presence of milk in a cow milking will suppress her fertility anyway. So there's lots going on there. So I mean, there's another one there that we probably haven't spoken about, Jason, is that body condition score with heifers at mating. Should we have a target there?
Yeah, we should. But actually, when I look at our beef progeny test data, which is on really commercial farms and big farms, and they don't do them any easier than anyone else. Most of those heifers are actually in pretty good body condition score. They're all sort of 7 and upwards, 7.5 and upwards. So yeah, I think if we get the weight there, then they'll be in reasonable nick.
Yeah, because it's really interesting, looking across all the cow matings over the years. That we're obviously into our 5th mating in the beef progeny test, but very responsive in cow condition to conception rate, and those cows have been AIing. But of course, there's a much bigger range in those cows, isn't there?
Sure, yeah. It's really interesting. Sort of below condition score 6, the fertility of the cows drops off markedly. From 6 to 7, 7.5, you're still getting a response. After that, putting more fat on the animal, putting more condition on the animal, you're not helping her at all. From a fertility point of view, she may be milking better, but then maybe she's out of condition because she's not milking as well.
Yeah.
So
and it's becoming pretty bloody expensive to feed her.
Yeah.
If they put on all that extra fat.
Yeah, certainly. 7 and better is quite adequate for fertility outcomes.
Yeah, and that's an interesting one, because we're hearing about farmers really pushing the fats, and we're talking about there being an optimum, a point where it's really valuable enough that it becomes expensive, and not having enough is also bloody expensive for in-calf rate.
Yep.
There's some genetic messages, around this. So there's the how, how to manage them, but there's also the how in terms of size to pick. You spoke about rib fat being important for heifer conception. How important is that as an EBV?
There's no doubt it's important as an EBV, but we've got to remember that it was originally designed as a carcass EBV tool rather than a cow EBV tool. The issue about going for positive fats, my personal belief is what that's doing is if we're having trouble getting our cows to a condition score of 6 or 7 in our farming system, then that's probably when we want to put a bit more fat into the animals, just to make them a little bit easier to get into that condition. But fat and fertility are actually two slightly different things. They're not the same thing. So I think fatness is about how easily can we get our cows into good condition in order to get those fertility outcomes. There's a subtle difference there, I know, and it's genetic and phenotypic are different issues, but so I guess the other message is, from a fertility point of view, we should still be looking at days to calving EBVs. They are the tool that's designed to look at fertility.
And if we before we move on from the fat thing, days to calving does encompass a relationship between heifer rib fat and in calf, or the days to calving EBV. So, I guess that is already accounted for in it. So, do we really want excessive fats? Is that a benefit on a genetic basis?
I don't think we want to be excessive. I think we've got to keep our end goal in mind. But to be honest, I don't think we've got definitive answers around that for our system at the moment. We're collecting a lot of data at the moment, and we'll be able to look at these things in a couple of years, and
see the consequences on the cow going forward.
And see the consequences on the cow going through. So that'll be really interesting once we have that data. But it'll take a bit of time to breed these animals and then get them into the herd and get a few calves out of them before we can really say a lot about that.
So when we talk about genetics and pushing up this, getting your heifers and calf, we talked about rib fat just then as an EBV when you pick your bulls.
Yep.
And we want some of that. Obviously there's an optimum, but you mentioned another one, days to calving. What's that talking about?
Yeah, so days to calving is essentially the number of days between the bull going out and the cow calving. So there's a bit of gestation length variation embedded in that as well, but in essence, really it's talking about how many cows getting in calf in the first cycle versus the second cycle versus the third cycle if the bull's still out in the third cycle. So it's a measure of that. It's sort of a trait that's not the easiest to understand and get your head around, but in essence that's what it's doing, and you want to get a more negative number. So like a -5 is better than a -4, for example. So because she's getting a calf quicker, there's fewer days between the bull going out and the average cow calving. So it's a great way to analyse the data. It's maybe not the best way to present it, to explain it. It's a difficult thing to understand, but you can sort of think of it as like calving rate, and rough rule of thumb, and it is a pretty rough rule of thumb, but a unit of days to calving might give you 1%, 1.5% of calving rate, depending on where your current calving rate is, and a few different factors like that, how long the bull's out for, etc. But think of it as calving rate.
I mean, like if we can get heifers calving and subsequently cows having less days between their calving earlier in the season, I guess that benchmark, you know, we've spoken about before, is about if we can get 70% in the first cycle with a natural mating, we're really nailing it.
Yep.
You know, that's doing well. If we can do that, we can get in calf early in the season. She's going to have a more productive lifetime. Now, I mean, there's another genetic component when you go and picking size, and that's the scrotal size EBV. How important is the scrotal size EBV?
So to me, a scrotal size EBV is a bull breeder's tool, not a commercial farmer buying a bull tool. So the reason why I say that is scrotal size EBV is related to female fertility and earlier puberty in heifers. There's no doubt about that. But that relationship is actually really built into the days to calving. So for females, focus on the days to calving EBV. So the scrotal size EBV is important because we've actually got to have bulls with enough serving capacity. So it's important for that, but that should be the issue of the breeder of the bulls. From a bull purchaser point of view, phenotypically the bull's got to have enough scrotal circumference and phenotype. But I wouldn't.
What you see in the bull.
And what you see in the bull, so that he's got enough serving capacity. But as long as he's got that, I would be focusing on the days to calving EBV rather than the scrotal size EBV.
And it's an interesting one. I mean, you know, and we've looked at the days to calving EBV within the beef progeny test, and it seems to be lining up surprisingly well.
Yeah, it is actually. I don't know if I'd say surprisingly well, Max, but it is lining up well, and it's just reinforcing the value of that EBV, even though it is, it's a lowly heritable trait. Fertilities, you can't make a lot of genetic progress in it, but you can go genetically backwards in it. So, yes, it's showing a good relationship with what's happening in our progeny test animals as yearling heifers getting a calf, and also getting back in calf as a 2-year-old. So, yep, it's an endorsement for days to calving, really.
Yeah, and I mean it's not a trait that's been, you know, really well recorded, and of course, you know, like you say, it's not highly heritable. So no, it's really positive to see that it is lining up fairly well. So, you know, there's some stuff you can do in your feeding or your management.
Yep.
And there's some other things you can do in your size selection when you go and consider picking your bulls if you want to tune up your heifer mating. In terms of our Trans-Tasman project, our partnership with the Australians, what's the things that we're doing? What measurements are we collecting in order to try and further that discussion and answer some of those harder questions?
Yeah, look, having some other indicators of fertility would be gold. Something, you know, potentially things that are a bit more heritable and more measurable. And one of the difficulties that we face in some of our evaluations and breeds that are using a lot of AI is we can't measure days to calving on an animal that's been synchronised and AI'd because of that synchrony effect. So if we could find some other indicators that are related to days to calving and to puberty, then that'd be great. So we're having a look at a couple of things. One is a measurement called antral follicle count, which is just using an ultrasound probe to look at the ovaries on a young heifer and count how many follicles there are, and these follicles are the things that go on and develop an egg and then shed an egg. So that's the beginning of fertility. So we're doing those counts to try and see whether that relates to her fertility outcomes. Early days yet though, jury's still out. It's a good idea, but we need to see whether it actually stacks up.
And there's been good examples of it lining up fairly well to reproductive outcomes, the conception date and rate in dairy cattle, and so it'll be interesting to see how it lines up in beef.
Yep, and also whether it's a genetic thing or a phenotypic thing. So is it a good breeding tool? So the other one we're having a look at is when the heifer actually goes through puberty, how early she goes through puberty. We're doing that by scanning them, and most of this has been done in Australia. We're doing a little bit in New Zealand, and we're scanning the heifers multiple times as they grow, and detecting the presence of what's called a CA, which is basically just shows that she's been through puberty. So we're having a look at that as well. It's a pretty intensive measure. There might be other ways of doing it. So another way of looking at whether an animal's cycling is to use collars or ear tags that have movement sensors in them. What you find is when you, in fact we did this back in further ago than what I'd like to mention, Max, but when I used to work in New South Wales in a place called Trangie, we had a bunch of heifers in a confined feeding situation. We're doing feed efficiency research, and we were trying to look at whether activity made a difference to them. So we actually sewed up some little pouches and glued them onto the side of the heifers and put a pedometer in there and counted it, brought them in once a day and measured their counts. And when the heifer cycles, those counts spiked from normally being about 3,000 a day, they went to 30,000 a day the day she cycled. It was like it just stands out. So if we could put collars or tags on and remotely measure the exact day that she's gone through puberty or started cycling, that might be a benefit too. But some of this research is showing some really puzzling things too. Like we're finding that when we do the scans and also when we look at the collars, that actually before the bull goes out, sometimes only half the heifers have cycled, or even less than half, and yet they're still coming back with good pregnancy rates after a 6-week joining. So
and often early in the mating period.
So that's a bit of a puzzle, I guess. When you start measuring things, you find some things out that you just assume some stuff, and it's not always, your assumptions aren't always right. So that's a bit of a puzzle to us.
It's interesting. I mean, in terms of other things we're measuring on those young females coming into these research programs in New Zealand and Australia for this Trans-Tasman project. Look, we've been scanning the heifers, like you say, but also been body condition score, weighing, hip height, taking hip height measurements on those heifers before they go to the bull. So we're getting a fair bit of stuff on what they look like, how they're going reproductively, and then I guess also some longevity or ongoing maternal stuff.
Yep. So to me, that's really where the proof is in the pudding, is how long does a cow stay in the herd, and the reason why most cows leave the herd is because they've failed to get back in calves. So longevity, that cost of rearing a replacement across the herd, a lot of that's about fertility, and it's something that we need to keep focusing on.
That's exciting. Now, Jason, there's obviously more questions to be asked in this. As we're going forward, we're now collecting heaps of data, and we'll be able to answer some of those questions further. But are there other questions that maybe we need to be asking?
Oh, look, there's always other questions. That whole relationship around cows, fatness, fertility, management, is the sort of cow that does the job in a situation where we're controlling her feeding, controlling her weight, not letting her get into a poor condition score. Is that the same genetics as what we need to do the New Zealand style system, where we put a bit of weight on them after weaning and then we strip it off over winter, and so there's some interesting stuff in there, and we're doing a bit of work with that as well, and hopefully this time next year or the year after we're going to have some really, really interesting stuff around some of those questions as well. So there's plenty happening.
Cool, exciting. Hey, and just in summary, it sounds like there's plenty of reasons you'll be wanting to mate your heifers.
Yep.
It sets up your lifetime reproductive performance. You wean heavier calves. She gets more likely to get back in calf early. All the various reasons. Then we talked about some reasons why you might want to do it on that end, but we talked about how you might do it in management. Feed your heifers, get them as heavy as you can, but also make plenty of them in a restricted joining period, 42 days, preferable. And then we talked about the size. Really consider the days to calving EBV first and foremost, but have a look at scrotal size and rib fat as threshold traits as well. And then I guess as we go on in these projects, we ask more questions and get them answered. It'll be an interesting thing going forward.
It will be. So, just before we sign off, Max, what song do you want to do your karaoke to?
Man, I Feel Like a Woman.
Man, I Feel Like a Woman. Away you go. Shania.